In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the English Channel lay shrouded in a cold mist. On the Normandy coast, at one of the strongest fortresses of the Atlantic Wall, Battery Crisbeck, German artillery officer Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen climbed up to the observation tower. He had no idea that within minutes, his eyes would witness a sight that would forever alter his understanding of the war. Ohmsen was a disciplined soldier, a firm believer in Berlin's propaganda that Germany could repel any invasion. The Atlantic Wall, with its thousands of bunkers, firing positions, and minefields, was advertised as an impenetrable steel fortress. For months, he and his unit had prepared to face a landing that German intelligence insisted would come at Pas de Calais, where the channel was narrower and far more favorable for the Allies. Normandy, in the minds of most German officers, was nothing more than a secondary battlefield. Yet as dawn broke, Ohmsen heard something unusual. A deep, rolling thunder from the sea, unlike ordinary artillery fire. Raising his binoculars, he watched the thinning mist gradually reveal an unbelievable sight. Warships and landing craft stretching across the horizon, east to west, seemingly without end. At first, he tried to remain calm, perhaps a few dozen, maybe even a few hundred ships. But the longer he observed, the clearer the terrifying truth became. Thousands of vessels of every size, moving in unison like a wall of steel advancing toward the French coast. At that moment, Ohmsen realized that every prediction, every confidence of the German High Command had been wrong. This was the real invasion, and it was unfolding right before his eyes. Later reports confirmed that the Allies had assembled nearly 7,000 warships, transports, and landing craft, the largest fleet in human history. It was not only a military operation, but a living demonstration of the overwhelming industrial power of the United States and Britain. Ohmsen had little time to reflect. Only minutes after the fleet emerged, the first roars of naval guns shattered the dawn. Shells weighing hundreds of kilograms rained down from Allied battleships and cruisers along the coast, shaking his command post to its foundations. The opening bombardment was so ferocious that many German gun positions were obliterated before they could even respond. What stunned Ohmsen most was not merely the firepower, but its sheer abundance. The Americans and British spared nothing, neither shells nor ships. The battleship USS Texas alone fired nearly 180 tons of shells in just 1 hour. To Ohmsen, a soldier accustomed to Germany's dwindling resources and the careful rationing of every artillery round, this was a display of strength unlike anything he had ever imagined. Meanwhile, the skies above no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. Instead of German planes swooping to defend, the entire Normandy airspace thundered with the engines of thousands of Allied aircraft. On June 6th alone, they flew more than 14,000 sorties, bombing, reconnaissance, and direct support for the infantry. In contrast, the exhausted Luftwaffe, crippled after years of relentless bombing campaigns, could only muster around 300 sorties, nowhere near enough to alter the tide. From his observation post, Ohmsen grasped a bitter truth. The Third Reich had gravely underestimated its enemy. For years, Hitler and Goebbels' propaganda had mocked Americans as lazy, undisciplined people, reliant only on material wealth. But now, staring at nearly 7,000 ships advancing in unison, Ohmsen could no longer doubt it. This material wealth was the very force that would decide the fate of the war. On beaches like Omaha and Utah, landing craft began to swarm ashore. Wave after wave of American, British, and Canadian soldiers charged the sand, braving fire from bunkers and machine guns. Many Allied units suffered horrific losses, especially at Omaha, where blood stained the surf red. But one terrifying reality became clear to Ohmsen. They did not stop. For every wave cut down, more ships arrived, more soldiers stormed the shore. Meanwhile, Germany's defenses were breaking apart. Long-entrenched artillery was silenced by naval barrages. Reserve units could not be deployed quickly enough amid chaotic communications, and critical shortages of supplies meant German troops could not replenish ammunition. To Ohmsen, it felt like watching an unstoppable steel tide, where every act of resistance was no more than throwing stones against a raging flood. What haunted him most was the arithmetic of war. On the very first day, the Allies landed 156,000 troops, along with tens of thousands of vehicles and thousands of tons of supplies. That alone outnumbered the entire German force in Normandy at the time. The sheer organizational and logistical capability of such an undertaking proved, beyond doubt, that Germany could not possibly prevail in a war of attrition. As the sun climbed higher, Ohmsen knew he was witnessing an irreversible turning point in the war. Through the eyes of an artillery officer, he did not merely see ships and soldiers, he saw the full might of American industry manifest upon the sea. And in that moment, Ohmsen admitted to himself, this war, sooner or later, was already lost. As the first waves of the landing crashed onto the beaches of Normandy, the Germans in their defensive positions felt, for a fleeting moment, a fragile sense of hope. The MG-42 machine guns screamed, cutting through the ranks of American soldiers as they leapt from their landing craft. Men fell one after another, the sand slowly turning into a blotched red stain. At Omaha, where steep cliffs and dense fortifications gave the defenders every advantage, the first waves of American troops suffered horrific casualties. From inside their bunkers, German soldiers shouted with brief exhilaration. They believed the Atlantic Wall was proving its worth. Mortars and rifles rained down, ripping through Allied formations. The moment the ramps of the LCVPs dropped, entire units of American infantry were wiped out within seconds. To the Germans, the scene seemed to confirm that they could still stop this colossal invasion. But that belief lasted only a moment. Minute by minute, new waves of landing craft kept arriving. The Americans, though cut down in staggering numbers, continued to surge onto the beaches. Each time one group was annihilated, another immediately took its place. The seemingly endless manpower left the German defenders shaken. They had never faced an enemy so relentless and so numerous. Offshore, the American and British fleet maintained a constant bombardment. When it became clear that German strongpoints were still inflicting devastating losses on the infantry, several destroyers made a daring, unprecedented move. They advanced to within just a few hundred meters of the shore. Vessels designed for deep-sea combat now swung their guns toward the land, blasting bunkers and machine gun nests at point-blank range. Each shell shook the earth. With every detonation, another wall collapsed, another pillbox crumbled. German soldiers, accustomed to thinking of warships as rare and irreplaceable naval assets, could scarcely believe their eyes. The Americans were willing to risk destroyers, even sacrifice them, just to save their infantry. To the Kriegsmarine mindset, losing a ship was an irreparable disaster. But to the Americans, warships were simply another product of industry, replaceable as long as victory required it. At the same time, Allied aircraft swarmed overhead. Waves of dive bombers and fighter bombers tore through the skies, almost continuously striking German positions and supply lines. Any attempt to move German tanks or infantry reinforcements toward the beaches was intercepted and destroyed on the roads. The German reserves, supposedly the hammer that would drive the Allies back into the sea, never reached the front at all. At Omaha, American casualties mounted by the hour. Entire units were shattered. Commanders fell almost as soon as they set foot on the sand. But what unnerved Ohmsen and his fellow officers was the unbreakable resolve of the enemy. The survivors did not retreat. They crawled forward from behind obstacles, regrouped in small squads, and inched toward the bluffs, exploiting every crack in the rocks, every fold of the terrain to push upward. The Americans brought up anti-tank guns, mortars, and grenades, steadily knocking out German strongpoints. Each time a machine gun nest was silenced, infantry poured through the gap, opening the way for the next assault. Every yard of ground was paid for in blood, but they never stopped advancing. Through his binoculars, Ohmsen saw the tide turning. What had looked like a beach littered with corpses and failure was slowly becoming a foothold. Naval fire from offshore continued to strike with precision, reducing once formidable defenses to rubble. The scene conjured a chilling comparison in his mind. This was no longer a clash of military units, but of entire industrial machines. Every time an American soldier fell, another stepped forward. Every time a ship was struck, hundreds more pressed on. The Americans fought with the conviction that losses were inevitable, and behind them stood an immense industrial engine ready to replenish anything consumed by battle. Meanwhile, the German defenders of Normandy were wearing down. Ammunition was running out, reinforcements never arrived, and morale wavered as the Allied fleet showed no sign of exhaustion. Officers tried to enforce discipline, but deep inside, many understood that this was no ordinary battle. This was a struggle beyond the endurance of any single army. By the afternoon of June 6th at Omaha, American troops had finally punched openings through the German line. Sherman tanks, field artillery, and supply trucks were dragged across the beaches. The arrival of tanks inland was the undeniable signal. Germany had lost control of the coast. From that point on, the invasion could no longer be pushed back. Ohmsen quietly stepped down from his observation post, his guns having fired their last shells. One thought echoed in his mind. We are fighting not just the American army, but the entire American industry. On the morning of June 7, 1944, as smoke and fire still hung over the beaches of Normandy, a different sight began to unfold. Not destruction, but construction. On shores still strewn with blood and wrecked landing craft, the Allied armies did not pause to rest. Instead, they immediately began building a logistical lifeline on a scale never before seen in history. On the first day alone, according to reports, the Allies had landed more than 156,000 troops, nearly 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and over 15,000 tons of supplies. This number exceeded the entire German force present in Normandy at the time. And most importantly, this was only the beginning. To sustain and expand their beachhead, the Americans and British needed a major port. But nearly every French port along the coast was either in German hands or had been sabotaged. The conventional solution would have been to seize Cherbourg or Le Havre, but that would take weeks, perhaps months, and the Allies could not wait. Instead, they executed a bold idea, building mobile artificial harbors, known as mulberries. Thousands of engineers and workers had prepared them in advance, constructing enormous hollow concrete blocks called Phoenix caissons, floating roadways stretching hundreds of meters, and detachable piers, all towed across the channel from England. Within days of the landings, these concrete blocks were sunk to form breakwaters, while the floating piers were assembled into functioning docks. The result was that within just 2 weeks, the Allies had 2 fully operational artificial harbors at Gold and Omaha beaches, capable of receiving thousands of tons of supplies and hundreds of vehicles every single day. Thanks to the mulberries, the American and British armies could continue pouring in men and materiel regardless of weather or German sabotage. When Ohmsen and his fellow German officers heard of this, they were stunned. To them, the idea of building a harbor at sea seemed almost inconceivable. They were steeped in the old logic of war, where seizing a port was a prerequisite for sustaining a campaign. But now they faced an enemy not only vast in numbers, but also technically agile and imaginative beyond anything they had imagined. Behind Mulberry lay something greater, the colossal industrial might that America had unleashed since 1942. To grasp its scale, one only had to look at the numbers. Aircraft, 1944. The United States produced nearly 96,000, while Germany built about 39,000. Tanks. The U.S. manufactured more than 29,000 compared to Germany's 18,000. Trucks. The U.S. fielded over 650,000, while Germany had only around 68,000. Warships and transports. the U.S. launched more than 2,700 Liberty ships, each able to carry thousands of tons of cargo at record speeds. A typical Liberty ship could be completed in just 42 days, and one, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built in only 4 days and 15 hours. For Ohmsen, these figures were no longer abstract. He had already seen their results with his own eyes at Normandy. The massive fleet he had watched advancing on June 6th was the living product of millions of American workers, from the steel mills of Pittsburgh to the shipyards of California to the truck assembly lines of Detroit. Germany, by contrast, entered 1944 with its industry under daily assault from American and British bombers. Industrial cities such as Hamburg, Essen, and Cologne lay in ruins. What factories remained suffered shortages of raw materials and manpower, increasingly dependent on prisoners of war and forced labor. The imbalance only grew wider, and in Normandy it was laid bare for all to see. Germany was not only losing on the battlefield, it was already defeated in the factories and on the assembly lines. This realization struck deeply at the psyche of many officers. They had believed victory could be achieved through tactics, through the discipline and courage of German soldiers. But when faced with a fleet of 7,000 ships, and with the Allies building harbors on the open sea, they began to understand that modern war was no longer a contest of strategic genius. It had become a race to produce more, faster, and to replace losses more quickly. One German officer later recorded in his diary, "We fight with courage, but they fight with an entire nation. Each of their soldiers does not stand alone. Behind him is a factory, an assembly line, a vast industrial country. And behind us, only the rubble of cities bombed to dust." This harsh truth spread quickly through the ranks of command. Though the Germans continued to resist fiercely in the weeks that followed, from Carentan to Caen, everyone knew the outcome was already decided. Once the Allies had poured millions of tons of supplies into Normandy, driving them back into the sea was impossible. For Ohmsen, the memory of those 7,000 ships on June 6th would haunt him forever. But it was the arrival of the mulberries and the endless streams of trucks and tanks flowing into the beachhead that truly drove home the lesson. Modern war was industrialized on a total scale, and in that race, Germany had never stood a chance. After June 6th, the beaches of Normandy were no longer just a battlefield. For German soldiers, they became a living testament to the collapse of everything they had once believed. For years, Goebbels's propaganda machine had hammered into their minds the notion that Germany was an impregnable fortress, that the American army was a weak force lacking fighting spirit, and that the mass production of American industry produced nothing but steel toys that could never replace German courage and skill. From leaflets to radio broadcasts to political indoctrination sessions in the barracks, the message was repeated relentlessly. We are superior. We are invincible. But the morning of June 6th shattered that illusion in an instant. When thousands of ships appeared, when the sky lit up with tens of thousands of naval shells, and when wave after wave of American, British, and Canadian soldiers stormed the beaches, despite the mounting dead, every German soldier was forced to ask himself, if they are weak, how could they bring an ocean of steel here? If they lack spirit, why do they keep charging up the sand, even as their comrades fall before their eyes? Many German officers were shaken. In those first days in Normandy, not a few witnessed the Americans suffering hundreds, even thousands of casualties, yet still maintaining formation. Some bunkers had fired until every belt of ammunition was gone, convinced that the beach had become a graveyard for the enemy, only to see, minutes later, fresh waves of soldiers disembarking from new landing craft. That persistence seemed irrational, almost inhuman, and it left the German defenders feeling that all their efforts were insignificant against that colossal machine. In the rare quiet nights when the guns fell silent, whispers spread among the troops. How many men do they have? How many tanks? How many ships? Is there even a limit? No one could answer. The only certainty was the sense that the enemy before them was not an army, but a tide, endless, wave after wave. The psychological weight grew heavier as news from the homeland reached them. Letters from families told of cities consumed by nightly bombing. Essen, Hamburg, Berlin, once proud centers of industry, were now piles of rubble. Production lines had halted, workers were dead or injured, raw materials scarce. Soldiers in Normandy understood that behind them was no limitless supply. They fought with whatever scraps remained, while the enemy seemed inexhaustible. One German lieutenant wrote in his diary a few days after D-Day, "We memorized the claim that Americans rely only on machines. Now that truth is killing us. Their machines are not weakness, they are strength. They can lose an entire unit and replace it with 3 more. We lose 1 platoon and it is gone forever." The gulf between propaganda and reality created a psychological shock of enormous proportions. In some places, German troops fought on in desperation, prepared to die for honor. In others, they surrendered or withdrew silently. For many, belief in victory had evaporated. That despair reached far beyond the ranks. Even the generals began to accept that the outcome was sealed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who had been tasked with fortifying the French coast, had already warned that if the Allies established a foothold on the first day, Germany would never drive them back into the sea. His prophecy came true on the beaches of Normandy. In the days that followed, Ohmsen watched convoys of American trucks, artillery, and tanks pour ashore through the mulberry artificial harbors. He knew that every shell fired, every act of defiance, was nothing more than a stone thrown against the tide. What tormented him most was not the military defeat itself, but the realization that he had been deceived. Years of faith in the propaganda, that Germany could prevail, that the enemy was unworthy, had dissolved into dust. In that despair, some German officers chose tragic ends. Some took their own lives in their bunkers, unable to accept that everything they had sacrificed, everything they had believed, was meaningless. Others, though they survived, carried the psychological wounds for life, haunted by the sight of the massive Allied fleet spread across the English Channel, a vision they knew would never leave them. The collapse of faith did more than break morale. It shook the very foundations of a regime built on lies. When soldiers returned from Normandy, they brought back stories of truth, that the Americans were not weak, that the Allies did not fear combat, that the enemy's industry had far surpassed anything Germany could imagine. Those stories spread, corroding the false facade that propaganda had tried to uphold. Years later, when the war was long over, Walter Ohmsen returned to Normandy. He stood silently before the sea, the same horizon once filled with 7,000 ships. Asked about that memory, he gave a simple reply that cut to the heart of history. "That day I fired into the vast fleet, but it was like throwing stones at the tide. We did not lose for lack of courage. We were defeated by American industry." That admission was not merely the voice of one soldier, it was a verdict on an entire regime that had placed its faith in illusions instead of reality. At Normandy, the truth stood bare. Modern war was no longer a contest of legends or lies, but a struggle of production, logistics, and economic might. And in that struggle, Germany had lost before the battle had even begun. When the landing wave succeeded, the Germans lost not only the beaches, but something far more critical, the initiative. Throughout the early years of World War II, Germany had always struck first. From the Blitzkrieg in Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, to the brutal offensives deep into the Soviet Union. But after June 6, 1944, that role was completely reversed. Now, Germany was forced into a reactive stance, scrambling to contain the enemy's advance while the Allies steadily tightened the noose. At first, Hitler and the High Command still clung to the belief that Normandy was merely a diversion, that the Allies' true assault would come at Pas-de-Calais, where the channel was narrower and German defenses strongest. That false conviction kept vital reserves, especially the armored divisions, from being deployed in time. In those decisive days, when the Americans and British were still vulnerable on the beaches, The Germans were unable to launch the large-scale counterattack that might have thrown them back into the sea. Instead, with each passing day, the Mulberry artificial harbors poured in hundreds of thousands of tons of weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The U.S. Air Force ruled the skies, turning daytime movement into a deadly gamble. Every convoy, every supply train ran the risk of being obliterated by air attack. The Germans were gradually strangled, not by head-on clashes, but by the immense logistical network the Allies built right on French soil. The Battle of Caen, which dragged on for weeks, exposed this imbalance clearly. Germany committed its finest divisions, Panzerlehr, the SS Hitlerjugend, hoping to halt the British and Canadians. They fought with grim determination, inflicting heavy losses. Yet in the end, as ammunition dwindled and fuel ran out, even the mighty Tigers and Panthers became lifeless hulks scattered across the fields. The Germans realized that superior engineering could not compensate for the gulf in logistics. Meanwhile, in the West, the Americans under General Omar Bradley launched Operation Cobra. Thousands of heavy bombers carpet-bombed German defenses, shattering entrenched positions. Then the Sherman tanks and American infantry poured through the breach, expanding the front with breathtaking speed. The Germans could not react in time. Many units were encircled in the Falaise pocket, where tens of thousands were killed or captured in a devastating collapse. That disaster turned Normandy into the graveyard of German armor on the Western Front. What remained were fragmented units, starved of fuel and ammunition, incapable of mounting any large-scale counteroffensive. With that breakthrough, the road to Paris lay open. In just weeks, the Allies advanced hundreds of kilometers through northern France. The people of Paris, after 4 years under occupation, rose alongside the French resistance. On August 25, 1944, when General Leclerc's division and the U.S. 4th Armored Division entered the capital, church bells rang out across the city. The liberation of Paris was not only a military triumph, it carried immense political weight, proving to the world that Hitler's regime could no longer hold Europe in its grip. From that moment, Germany's downfall was only a matter of time. In the East, the Soviet Red Army surged forward, sweeping German forces from Poland and the Baltics. In the West, the Allies reached Germany's frontier, preparing to cross the Rhine. The jaws of a two-front war closed tighter and tighter, leaving the Reich in a hopeless position. Yet while soldiers at the front struggled with grim reality, Hitler remained trapped in illusions. He placed his faith in miracle weapons, the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet fighter, believing they would reverse the tide. But however advanced, these weapons could not alter the truth. Germany was depleted of resources and manpower, while its enemies commanded an ocean of raw materials and tens of millions of workers and soldiers. At Normandy, the turning point had been sealed. For the Americans, the victory was more than a gateway into Europe. It was proof of the power of industrial warfare. For the Germans, it was the ultimate evidence that they had entered a conflict far beyond their nation's capacity. What Walter Ohmsen and his comrades felt as they gazed upon the Channel, the helplessness before a steel tide, was a microcosm of Germany's fate in the entire war. After Paris, the Allies did not pause. They pressed eastward, liberating Belgium and Luxembourg, then driving into the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. One German city after another fell, and by spring 1945, when the Red Army from the east and the Anglo-Americans from the west met at the Elbe, the fate of the Third Reich was sealed. It had all begun at Normandy, where 7,000 ships, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and an industrial machine of unprecedented scale proved an undeniable truth. In the 20th century, war was no longer decided by individual bravery or a handful of technological marvels. It was determined by production, logistics, and the ability to sustain power on a colossal scale. And in that contest, the United States and its allies towered far above Nazi Germany. Reflecting on his memories of Cherbourg, Walter Ohmsen once remarked that he was nothing more than a man throwing a stone against a tidal wave. That image captured not only the feelings of an artillery officer on June 6th, but the condition of Germany after Normandy itself, swept away by a tide that nothing could resist, the tide of industry, of logistics, and of the collective will of an international alliance. On June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy witnessed not only one of the largest military operations in human history, but also a decisive turning point for the entire 20th century, when 7,000 ships and more than 150,000 Allied soldiers set foot on French soil. They did more than begin the liberation of Europe from Nazi tyranny. They affirmed a truth. The new century would belong to those nations that mastered industry logistics and collective strength. In the short term, Normandy was a catastrophe for Germany. It shattered the belief that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable and proved that Anglo-American industrial might could overcome any line of defense. From Normandy, the Allies advanced to Paris, pushed into Germany, and forced Hitler to confront a two-front war on an unprecedented scale. It was the decisive strategic blow that drove the Third Reich to the brink of collapse in less than a year. Yet in the long view, Normandy meant far more than a military victory. It stood as undeniable proof of the transformation of modern warfare. The 19th century had been defined by battles of individual weapons and tactical brilliance. At Normandy, those elements were secondary. What truly decided the outcome was not a superior rifle or a more talented officer, but the ability to mobilize an entire global production machine, from Detroit's factories to Omaha Beach. This explains why so many German officers, from Walter Ohmsen to Rommel, admitted that they did not lose for lack of courage or skill, but because Germany could not match America in industry and logistics. The Tigers and Panthers may have dominated in individual tank duels, but thousands of Shermans rolling off American assembly lines carried the day. Every Liberty ship launched in mere days instantly replaced losses caused by the U-boats. On a global scale, every small German triumph was drowned out by the sheer tide of Allied production. Normandy also laid the foundation for the New World Order that emerged after 1945. When American and British troops landed in France, they brought not only weapons but also a message. In the modern age, international power would rest on alliances, cooperation, and economic interconnection. Operation Overlord was the product of tight coordination between nations, the United States, Britain, Canada, and the French resistance. Its success proved that collective strength could defeat any dictatorship, no matter how brutal or formidable. At the same time, Normandy marked the beginning of America's rise as a global superpower. Before the war, the United States still leaned toward isolationism. After D-Day, no one could deny that American economic and military strength had reshaped the fate of Europe. From then on, the U.S. was no longer a distant nation across the ocean, but the central pillar of global power, the cornerstone of NATO, and the architect of Western security. For Europe, Normandy became a symbol of rebirth. It was not only a campaign of liberation, but the starting point of a new Europe, emerging from the darkness of fascism and moving toward democracy and cooperation. The images of Parisians welcoming the liberating armies entered collective memory, reminding the world that freedom may be trampled temporarily, but it can never be extinguished. From a human perspective, Normandy offered a stark lesson on the cost of delusion. Nazi propaganda had convinced millions that they were invincible, that their enemies were weak. The harsh reality at Normandy shattered that illusion. It showed that in war, truth ultimately belongs to objective reality, not to lies repeated endlessly. The spiritual legacy of Normandy endures in the thousands of graves at Colleville-sur-Mer and other cemeteries. On the green lawns, rows upon rows of white crosses stretched to the horizon. They mark the price an entire generation paid for freedom. Visitors come not only to mourn but to remember that peace is never guaranteed. It is built on blood, sacrifice, and painful lessons from history. For Walter Ohmsen and the surviving German officers, Normandy remained a haunting memory. They recalled not only defeat, but the moment they realized the truth. Warfare had entered a new era, and Germany had chosen the wrong contest. Soldiers who once believed they fought for a mighty empire were forced to admit that it was all an illusion, crushed by the power of industry and international cooperation. More than 80 years later, when the world remembers D-Day, it recalls not only staggering numbers, 7,000 ships, 150,000 troops, millions of tons of supplies, but also its human meaning. The day mankind proved that while dictatorships may sow fear, unity, perseverance, and collective strength will always prevail. Normandy was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of the end. More importantly, it was the milestone that showed humanity had entered a new era, one in which national power was measured not only by soldiers in uniform, but by the capacity to mobilize knowledge industry and the collective spirit of a people. As one historian once wrote, "If Stalingrad proved that Germany could be defeated, Normandy proved that Germany would be defeated." And that is Normandy's greatest legacy, the affirmation that freedom, when defended by collective strength, will always outlast the storms of tyranny.